From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, our podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price. By Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. If you are buying a house in one of those states, if you're buying real estate in general in one of those states, give Justin a call. They will absolutely make your life much, much better. You're going to get the best possible rate. They also specialize in first home buyers. If you don't really know exactly what you should be looking for, they are the best in the business to deal with on this. Give them a call. Let them know you heard about them from Unconquered with Doc Staples. By Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. By Shenandoah Newsma of Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, and by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. And this week, I'm just going to let you know, it's going to be an unusual week. Look, Florida State is playing Charleston Southern. I am not going to do a preview episode of the Charleston Southern game, and I'm not going to do a hot takes episode immediately after either. Look, guys, it's Charleston Southern. And if Florida State loses this game to Charleston Southern, I don't even know what to say. But I don't expect them to lose this game. I don't expect it to be pretty. But neither team has scored over 24 points on the season, and Florida State scored 24 last in the opener. So, this is kind of first to 20 wins. And I think ultimately the big separator here is likely to be that Charleston Southern's just not going to score enough points. End of story. They're not going to be able to move the football, not going to be able to win the game because of it. I don't expect it to be pretty. Like I said, Florida State doesn't play pretty football this year, but that's as much of a preview as you're going to get from me. I'm also not, like I said, I'm not going to do an immediate hot takes episode after that. I don't think it's worth wasting your time on that. I will do some later analysis after that. I'll go over a couple of the last games and discuss that and start prepping a preview for the Florida game. But yeah, there's no use wasting time on that. Plus, I'm going to be in California over the weekend, so starting on Thursday. So it's just going to make it easier for me. And like I said, ordinarily I would gear up and do all of that on the road anyway. It's just not worth it. That said, for this week, instead of that, I'm going to do another mailbag episode because the questions keep rolling in and there's still just tons of things to discuss, a lot of material to get through. So let's just go ahead and get to it. Okay, first question. This one is, okay, so someone's asking what I think about some things that Jeff Cameron recently said. Now, I've not listened to Cameron's audio itself, but I'll just read the summary here. It says, I agree with Jeff Cameron. Something terrible has happened to the psyche of this team that has caused them to quit when other down-and-out teams don't. Could be the playoff snub, as you opined a while back. So while Mike can change coaches and likely many players, I agree with Jeff Cameron that Mike has to do some soul-searching and ask himself how he should change to get a tougher team, both physically and mentally. It's not easy late in life to reinvent yourself and make it appear sincere. Brian Kelly has tried, and it's not quite working. I'd be curious if you agree with Cameron's take, and if so, what you think Mike has to change personally. Okay, so first of all, I do agree that something happened to the psyche of this team. I mean, go back to the episode that I did on accountability, and Florida State has an accountability problem, and that's something that I address in full on that episode. I mean, that's what I spent the whole episode on, is that something has happened, something in terms of accountability, something went wrong. A couple of you have pointed out that things actually didn't look bad in the opener in terms of the body language, quit, all those other things. And a couple of you have pointed out that, that team from the opener, Florida State's team in the opener, probably beats the current team by 21, 28 points. Because the current team has folded. And the way that they work, the way that they strain isn't there at all. Whereas the first week, things looked like it was teetering a little bit, but things looked okay. Wasn't great, but it looked a whole lot better. And then something happened. I mean, and I agree. Some of you have said this. Something happened in Ireland. I don't know what that is. This is one of those things where I think the 30 for 30 about last year's team and this year's team is gonna deserve an Emmy. And the thing is, for all they do with the cinematic recap and all that stuff, they've got cameras going. Who knows? We may end up finding out one day what happened. But this is the kind of thing where something changed on that trip. And I do suspect that the fact that you have that gut-wrenching loss in week 1 after the travesty, after the snub, and you come back in week 1, and not only do you lose in week 1, but you lose in week 1 internationally, and then you have to spend another day there, and then you have to have a transcontinental flight over the ocean, and then you go through all that. Something happened in that process where things went very, very wrong, went very, very bad, and the whole team kind of soured. I don't think there's any question about that, because they looked sluggish, they looked different. Some of that was jet lag, I'm sure, but things looked different as early as the BC game. And then after the BC game, the wheels started coming off. So absolutely, I agree with that part of things. And I think Cameron, in as much as he's said that, if he's said that in as many words, I agree with him. Now, in terms of that going back to Mike Norvell, I do think some of that it has to go back to Norvell. The buck stops at the top. And in that accountability episode, what I talked about was the need for the guy at the top to be unyielding and demanding and to not tolerate anything less than great, to set the standard at all times. And that there have been times in this program where I've felt like that's not always been the case, where if there's one thing, and this is the answer to the second part. If there's one thing I think Mike Norvell needs to sort of take a look at himself in the mirror and address, it's that Norvell he's a coach with positivity coach. He's a guy who believes in treating people well, in inspiring people, in setting the example for how things are done, and then letting them follow him. That's what he believes in. And you know what? I'm that kind of coach too. When I teach, that's what I believe in. I believe in an inspirational model rather than a strictly fear-based model. That's what I believe in. But the problem is, if you go full on positive and you go full on inspirational, there's a certain point where you run into walls. If everything is carrot and there's no stick, then you're gonna wind up eventually having some problems. Especially if you don't have natural enforcers on your football team or on your coaching staff. So this is something that, like, Coach Bowden had Mickey Andrews. He had Chuck Amato. He had some of those guys on his staff. Coach Bowden led with a positive, inspirational approach in general. Now, Coach Bowden would also hold guys accountable. Don't get me wrong. But when it came down to it, he had his enforcers on the staff. And I do wonder, on the current staff, who's your enforcer? Who are your guys where the team knows they love him, knows that guy loves him, but they also kind of fear him a little bit? Who is that guy? Who's your Luca Brasi? You got to have that guy. You got to have your wartime consigliere too. And I feel like Mike it sort of works. I feel like Mike doesn't have a wartime consigliere on his staff. He's got to think about the balance, the chemistry on the next staff of bringing somebody in who's going to be that heavy. Now, Odell in the past has been that at times, but I do think that has, and again, this is just my judgment from the outside, has softened a little bit with age. And, that's normal. That's natural. Even Nick Saban sort of softened a little bit with age. But I think that's part one. And the other part is Norvell is fairly conflict averse in the sense that he's not a guy who's going to go out and seek out conflict. He's a guy that he may provide warnings or whatever, but it hurts him. You can tell it hurts him to bring out the stick. And if there's one thing that Norvell has to, you say change personally, I would just say change in terms of approach. It's to balance out just a little bit in terms of not just carrot, but also bring enough of a stick that guys will run through the wall for you. And that's the thing. He is so inspirational. He is such a positive example that guys want to play for him. They want to do well for him. They love him. But I don't know how many guys on this team, on this roster, fear him or are afraid to disappoint him in that respect. And I think prior rosters, even without, major enforcers in the coaching staff, there were guys on those rosters that raised the temperature. They set the temperature of the team because they were enforcers. They were guys who would carry the stick. They were guys who didn't allow the standard to slip. You go back to Dylan Gibbons. You go back to Jermaine Johnson, to Jared Verse, to Fisk, to some of these guys. Like, they raised the level around them so much and they demanded that other guys follow them. This team has none of that leadership. And I think when you lack that leadership, I think that's when having a coach who's a little bit feared, at least a little bit feared, matters. And, that's not the fun part of coaching. But I do think if there's one thing that Norvell's got to do, and this has to start in the off season. He has to start with, if it were me, if I were Norvell, first day of off-season conditioning, I would go out of my way to make an example of certain guys and certain leaders on my team and guys who I want to be leaders on my team. If they so much as slowed up half a yard before running through a line, if their hips weren't high enough, or if their hips weren't low enough, that they weren't bending their knees enough on a drill, whatever. And I would wear those guys out, and I would go out of my way to do that across the board, but especially with my best guys who I expect to be leaders. And I would set that example and set that bar of even right now, there is a zero tolerance policy for anything but perfection. And set that example of there's going to be consequences and accountability if that's not met. That, to me, was the secret sauce as much as anything of the Coach Bowden era. We took pride in the fact that we outworked everybody. And look, I wasn't any good, but I took a lot of pride in how hard I worked. And there were a bunch of guys on those teams that I was a part of who were exactly the same way. They worked their tails off. Some of the hardest working guys on our team were also the best players on our team. Guys like Quan. Greg Jones was a hard worker. Todd Williams worked his tail off. That entire offensive line, Milford, Marambo, Donald Heaven, Montre, all those guys, Jared Moon, Justin Ammon, all those guys worked. Brett Williams. And notice I just named a bunch of offensive linemen. Look, a lot of the hard work in your program has to start there. There in defensive line. You got to have guys that just live in the weight room and are there for more than the formal workouts that you have in your program. You have to have that. And that's got to be player led as much as anything. But we took pride in that. And a large percentage of that also was in mat drills. And you will never persuade me that the tragedy of Devon Darling wasn't as big a factor in Florida State's decline after that as anything. Because that changed the way that changed the trust that we had. It changed the way that the coaches could push us. It changed a lot about the program. I mean, I remember Matt Drills my first year and Matt Drills my second year, and it wasn't quite the same thing. And look, Devon's life was worth more than all that success. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, that tragedy was, I mean, yeah, I'm not even going to go any further on that. Yeah. Point being, they're going to have to, Mike Norvell emphasizes the work and recruits guys based on the work, pushes the idea that you better be about that work. But the bottom line is, if guys aren't going to put in that work and be perfect on every rep and give and sell out on effort on every rep in their conditioning and everything else, then he better give them that work. That to me is the big thing. Obviously, a lot of discussion has been happening about Florida State's use of the transfer portal and lack of high school recruiting. What are some of the things that you would change or approaches that you would do differently when looking at the transfer portal and high school recruiting? Okay, that's a good question. I actually want to start with a little bit of sort of philosophical discussion of this, and that is, I think the narrative that Florida State lived in the transfer portal too much, and that's the reason for their slide this year, I think that's overblown. The idea that, well, you know, if you don't recruit in high school, you just, you know, here's your example of what happens if you don't recruit in high school enough. Y'all, Florida State has recruited in high school better than 7 of the 9 teams that have beaten them. So consider that. And then when you look around the country, you've got right now, Colorado is a 1-loss team. Arizona State's a 2-loss team. Both of those teams, both of those programs have taken more transfers than Florida State. They've taken double the number of transfers as Florida State the last couple of years. Ole Miss has taken more transfers and has put less emphasis on recruiting in high school than Florida State has. So Florida State's a convenient narrative for a lot of people who want to emphasize the importance of high school recruiting. And don't get me wrong, I've talked about the need to recruit in high school to sustain long-term high-level success. That said, I do think long-term high-level success is going to be harder in the current model than it has been. Because even if you recruit great from high school, it takes high school guys a couple years generally before they're fully ready to be that guy in high school. So, you know, if you're going to have success this year, and I talked about this before, if Florida State was going to have success this year, it was going to be contingent on the 2020 and 2021 recruiting classes, not the 23 and 22 recruiting classes. And it turns out that the 20 and 21 classes were Florida State's weaker ones. They were some of the weakest they've had. And even if they weren't, the difficulty of keeping your talent on campus, of talent retention in the current space, in the current situation in college, is so hard that even if you recruit great, if you're having guys transfer out, it doesn't matter. So it's about more than that. To me, Florida State got burned this year because they did a poor job of evaluation in the portal. They had done a fabulous job of evaluation in prior years. And I talked about this on a prior show, but they had done a fabulous job in prior years. And my impression was that this cycle, and they may deny it, but this cycle, I think they changed the way that they went about their evaluation process. I think they rushed some stuff. I think some of the guys that they brought in are guys that they probably wouldn't have brought in prior years. And I think they also went after a different kind of guy in certain cases than what they'd gotten out of the portal in prior years. So let's take a look at this. Let's take a look first at the 2022 recruiting class and who FSU brought in there. So first of all, you're looking at Bless Harris. He was a starter and a high-level prospect from a lower-level program who wanted to move up and play for a contender. And all the tools were there, and the work ethic seemed to be there as well. And he had multiple years to play. You had Caden Lyles, a guy from Wisconsin, the center from Wisconsin, who they wanted to bring in. He had been hurt, but he had been a starter at Wisconsin. They rolled the dice on him because he'd been injured, and if he could be healthy, he could be an upgrade there. They took him. He wound up getting hurt again. Didn't factor. They had Micah Pittman. Pittman was a starter for Oregon. Now, when Oregon's coaching staff changed, Pittman was not a guy that wanted to stick around, but he was a starting punt returner. He was a starting wide receiver at Oregon. Okay? Also multiple years left to play. Johnny Wilson was a starter at Arizona State. Arizona State also had some turmoil there. Wilson also had some injury stuff that was going on, but he was a starter and he had flashed when he did play, but he was a guy that, you're rolling the dice on high level traits, and a guy that, again, has been a starter at a peer program. Greedy Vance went from Louisville to Florida State. He was a co-starter at Louisville. He was more of a dice roll, but that's what he was. Deuce Spann was a multi-year project, basically, with high-level physical tools, and a guy that you were banking on developing. And he never really developed. And for that, you blame your coaching staff as much as anything. But you're rolling the dice on him. He had moved from quarterback. This was not a situation of him not being able to earn playing time. He was just at a new position, wanted to go from Illinois to Florida State. He had already flashed a little bit in his first year at that new position. Okay. Tatum Bethune, starter at UCF, moving up. Jared Verse, 1AA player, FCS player, moving up with elite physical traits. Winston Wright, starter at West Virginia, moving up to Florida State. You're starting to get a trend here, right? Trey Benson was not a starter, but was a guy who you were really high on before. Elite level traits, sprinter speed at 215, 220 pounds. Didn't really get to do it at Oregon, partly because he got hurt. Roll the dice there. Dimitri Emmanuel, lower level from Charlotte, moving up. He came over with Atkins. You knew what you were getting with him. And again, moving up a level with a couple years to play. Jazz Turnitine, he was a guy you just took more or less for depth. Malik Feaster, guy you took for depth. Last minute, you had an extra spot, so you gave him a last minute spot. But again, coming up from Jacksonville State, Keziah Holmes, you didn't put on scholarship, but coming from Penn State, you took him, and he was a guy that really didn't play, kind of got passed over at Penn State. But you took him, and there was really no risk because of the situation in which you took him. Okay, so that's 2022. 2023, Darrell Jackson, starter at Miami, moving up a level. Miami, Florida. Jaheim Bell, starter at South Carolina, moving up a level to go to Florida State. Kyle Morlock, going from shorter college to Florida State, moving up a level with multiple years to play. Casey Roddick, starter at Colorado, moving up to play at Florida State. Jeremiah Byers at UTEP, moving up to play at Florida State with multiple years left. Braden Fisk, going from Western Michigan, moving up from the group of five to play at Florida State. And a starter who had flashed against top-level competition when he did play them. Fentrell Cypress, a starter at Virginia, moving up. Keandre Jones, you're taking him for depth. He's been a depth piece for you. He was a guy that was a depth piece at Auburn. Gilbert Edmond, starter at your farm program at South Carolina. Didn't work out that great, but he was a starter. Keon Coleman, need I say more? Justin Cryer, he was a immediate transfer. He may as well have been in your recruiting class because he transferred before ever going to Northwestern, essentially. That's what you got in your transfers, okay? So there's some trends here. Now let's take a look at 2024. Marvin Jones Jr. at Georgia for 2 years wasn't able to crack the starting lineup, really. Now, you could argue banged up with his shoulder and all of that, but was pretty healthy the prior year and was not as good as the guys that they had. But it's Georgia. You'll take it. They'd have taken him probably in prior classes too, especially given what they had out of him in high school. Jaylen Brown from LSU didn't play pretty much at all as a true freshman. You're going off of your high school evaluation. Guy with lots of years to play, but a guy that was not able to crack the depth chart at all at LSU. Earl Little, same deal from Alabama, but you're dealing with a multi-year guy here. So you're trying to sort of build for the future with him. Grady Kelly was a starter at a lower level at Colorado State, moving up. So he matches the profile pretty well, but without the elite traits of some of the other guys. Jalen Lucas, starter at Indiana, matches the profile, got injured. Devontae Brown, going from Miami to Florida State. He's a backup who was not able to play at a high level at Miami, and you're rolling the dice. He's not a guy that would have fit in any of the other classes. Malik Benson played at Alabama, got passed over by multiple wide receivers, was unproductive there, moved over to Florida State after being unproductive 1 year to play. DJ Uiagalelei, we could break this one down until we're blue in the face, but a guy who sort of had a little bit of a resurgence at Oregon State, but certainly not an elite prospect by any stretch. We all knew that coming in. Tomiwa Durajaye, a multi-year player, more of a developmental prospect from West Virginia, where he did start. So he's a guy you probably take in prior classes. Sione Lolohea, good player and a starter all-conference prospect from Oregon State, and he's been one of your best players. TJ Ferguson, a guy who couldn't crack the depth chart at Alabama. Roydell Williams, co-starter at Alabama. That's a decent take. That's fine. Richie Leonard, starter at Florida. You'll take him. Jacob Rizzi, moving up from Harvard. He's been okay. You'll take him. Omarion Cooper, a guy who left your program to go to Colorado and then returned. Okay. Cam Riley, similar deal to others. He was a co-starter at Auburn. And Sean Murphy, a guy who couldn't crack the roster, the depth chart at Alabama. There are several guys on this roster. Several of the, and yeah, I know that's a lot to go through on that. But what I wanted to try to highlight is to get to some of the patterns here and some of the differences with what they did in recruiting the prior couple classes out of the portal and what they took last year. Last year was a bunch of guys from Alabama, Auburn, Florida. They took 5 guys from Alabama, only one of which was really a full-time player at Alabama, and that was Roydell Williams, who split time at running back. The rest of them, the other guys from Alabama, were guys who didn't crack the depth chart at Alabama. Same with Jaylen Brown at LSU. What they did is they took more players who really weren't able to earn their spots at their current places and move them over. Now, a couple of those guys, maybe they've got a little bit more time and it's not an entire bust, but I'm not so sure that you're making the best call there. And I think moving forward, they need to change the way that they're doing this. You can't take your Devontae Browns. You can't take the TJ Ferguson type, even though, they look great on the hoof. You've got to go after guys who fit more the profile of what they went after in prior classes. And so what that means is you kind of have to split it. Number one is you have to absolutely be certain of the character of the guys you're bringing in. I think they brought a couple guys in who've not been great fits culturally. But you have to be absolutely certain of the character, first of all, that has to be a non-negotiable. But the other thing is you got to swing for the fences with some of the guys who have elite traits. So I actually am fine with taking a guy like Benson who has that elite home run speed, as long as you've got other options as well. You take a swing there. But ideally, to me, you take the guy with the traits who's trying to move up a level. So you look at the difference between, say, a guy like Uiagalelei, who's coming from a fellow at the time Power 5 program and also transferred over from Clemson, and he wasn't setting the world on fire at either place. You compare that to a guy like Treshaun Ward, who set the world on fire at the lower level, then came up and was a productive, dynamic player in a sort of lower level Power 5 program, and then wants to move up. That's the kind of player I think you have to focus on. Look at the guy who's been dominant where he's been and bring him in. So if I'm evaluating coming into next year, I want transfers who, first of all, I'm sort of putting it into two buckets. One is the transfers who I know I'm trying to help. I'm trying to fill spots this year. I'm trying to make sure that I've got guys who can contribute and play now. And then you've got the other bucket of guys that are developmental, and they're going to have both because the recruiting class is, kind of falling apart. You have to have both. But for those guys who you're depending on in year one, or you expect to play in year one, you have to have two buckets. One is the guys who've been dominant, and they're just trying to find a better opportunity to move up and to play for someone who's going to be more of a contender. You have to get those guys who have been really productive. If they've been productive before, they're probably going to be productive for you. Secondly, you have to find a couple of the whales. You have to land a couple elite guys, your Keon Coleman's, your, the guys who come ready-made and are difference makers. You got to get one or two of those minimum in your portal class. You have to. But you go for productivity and then a couple splash guys, and then you backfill with guys who are developmental prospects. And there you have to evaluate them a lot like what you would do in high school. And you say, okay, character. Does he have the traits and the tools to develop into what we need? And how long is it going to take? How many years does he have? You have to split it into those two buckets. And my impression was when you're bringing in a TJ Ferguson who's not been productive and you're hoping to plug him in as a starter this year, that's a big gamble. That's what they can't do. You're taking Benson, who was not setting the world on fire at Bama, and then you're going to plug him in year one as your number one wide receiver. Look, I missed that one too, but you have to go back and evaluate process. And I think the process there is if he wasn't dynamic and productive and, pushing on special where he was, odds are he's not going to be that in year one for you either. You bring in Keon Coleman. Coleman was special at Michigan State. He flashed everything at Michigan State already. And then he got to Florida State and he was what he was at Michigan State. So that's what you have to do. And then again, like I said, you're going to have to backfill with guys that you're taking swings on in terms of developmental possibilities. This is where a guy like Durajaye is a guy you take. I would take him this class, next class, all of that, just because, again, you've got to have those guys to develop on your bench as well. Now, you hope that maybe they come in and outperform, but you're recruiting those guys who have, say 3-4 years remaining. And essentially you have to treat those guys as an extension of your recruiting class. So to me, that's the buckets. I guess you got three buckets. You have an extension of your recruiting class, guys with 3-4 years remaining, who you evaluate as he's probably going to be a backup initially, can be some depth, but can develop into something special. Those guys you bring in. Otherwise, you're focusing on guys who are moving up a level, who've been super productive, and guys that you've graded out as he's special. That's what you have to focus on. Florida State brought in too many guys who are mid, or too many guys who were really potentially a developmental guy, but needed to contribute right away. Too much of that. You can't have that in the next class. So that's where your evaluations have to change. And like I said, that's the thing where I think they got burned, And you combine that with some of the other issues they had in terms of leadership and other issues on this team, and that's where that all goes down to. Now, on the high school recruiting side, to me, it boils down to this. You have to pay and you have to commit to the line of scrimmage and the quarterback position. I think you can generally find pretty good, productive skill talent in the portal. Offensive tackles, defensive ends cost a fortune in the transfer portal. And you've got to be able to grow some of those. You've got to grow some of those in your own house. Now, this next year, I think you probably pay the money for a couple of the guys that are going to cost a fortune at some of those positions, because you're going to have to. Now, the difficulty is, what does that do with your NIL structure and all of that? That's another place where Norvell and the Florida State organization are going to have to handle things to basically set a structure. I think they're going to have, and I think a lot of teams are going to start doing this, where they're going to set essentially, here's our salary cap, here's where you slot in, and this is going to be the way that this is going to work. And they essentially no negotiating beyond that. Like, you have to treat it like the rookie system in the pros, where like, here's where our value is on you, and if you don't like that, then you're gonna have to go. And again, this is where Norvell and some of the folks around Florida State are going to have to be willing to be the bad guy a little bit more than maybe they've been comfortable in the past. So that's where I fall in on the acquisition side, and then and retention. And then just in terms of other changes to make in the high school ranks, aside from just absolutely pulling out the stops to bring in the best line of scrimmage talent you can, that you can then develop and retain on your campus, the other thing is that you just have to put in more effort. I mean, I did talk to actually a fellow alum of Florida State who's coaching at a school in Georgia. And he coached a player who's now starting at a college football playoff contender in year one. And Florida State's position coach basically just didn't really put in any effort with him. That you can never have again. That can never happen again. You can never have a situation where 2 months go by and that coach, who's an alum of your program, and his player have not heard from you. Can't happen. That's the other thing. Okay, now to some other questions, and the rest are going to basically be on the coaching side in terms of coaching changes. All right, so next question is, do you think any of these coaches would come to FSU, or that Norvell would be interested in them? Number one, Cade Bell, offense coordinator at Pittsburgh. Brad White, defense coordinator at Kentucky. Jim Leonard, former Wisconsin defense coordinator and current passing game and defensive backs coach at the Denver Broncos. And Zach Arnett, former Mississippi State head coach, etc. Okay, so I'll address that first. Two of those names are on the list, on the list of people that have kind of circulated behind the scenes of guys that, from credible sources, seem to be on, in Norvell's Rolodex, as it were. And that is Jim Leonard, who I did not mention in my first podcast there, even though I'd heard his name kind of a little bit. My thought was, he's a guy that always gets talked about every time there's an opening. Did for a long time when he was at Wisconsin, and nothing is ever going to come of that. And he's probably not going to be interested in going to Florida State from the NFL, et cetera. Move on. Not even going to address it on that podcast. And then I heard a little bit more after I recorded it. I mean, within a day, or somebody sent me a note and said, "Why didn't you mention?" I was like, "Well, really?" It's like, "Yeah." Oh, so yeah, I think, from what I understand, there's a real possibility that Jim Leonard would be interested in coaching under Mike Norvell at Florida State, and that Mike Norvell would have him very high on his list, if not at the top of his list. It's entirely possible. Now, again, whether he would actually want to come in and do that now in the situation that it's in, I don't know. And whether Mike would actually offer him the job, I don't know. But he is a viable candidate from what I understand. Someone who actually is a possibility. Zach Arnett is another guy that has sort of been buzzed around among people that I think are pretty well connected. And, he's another guy. He's got some head coaching experience. He's been a pretty good defensive coordinator, put together some quality defenses at a place that can't really recruit as much. Arnett would not be, and by the way, I'll just say this. Leonard, to me, would be a splashy hire and certainly would be a quality coordinator and a guy that, I think can attract some talent as well. I'm not sure about the match of what he wants to do defensively, or what he did at least at Wisconsin defensively. I'm not sure how much of a match that is for what you want to do, but he's a flexible guy. He's a Rex Ryan disciple, and he can play a lot of different defenses. He's also got a lot of NFL experience and can handle the helmet communication stuff and some of the things that they've not done well. So, I think he would be, look, I'd have no complaints. I'd have a little bit of reservation about maybe not he wouldn't necessarily be the number one hire for me, but he would be on my, in my top 3 or 5 hires. Jim Leonard would be way up there. And yeah, there would be nothing really to complain about. If you land him, you're happy. That's a solid play. Now, Arnett, to me, I would not be super thrilled with that hire. He's a guy that I'm not sure. I think he's probably a better overall coordinator than Fuller, but I'm not sure how much he brings to the table as a recruiter as well. And I don't think he's an elite coordinator. And I think if you're not getting a guy who's a great recruiter, you have to have him on the elite to borderline elite coordinator side of things. And I think Leonard, with his history as a coordinator, you're pushing on elite territory with him in the past. So, you're satisfied with what you're getting there. Arnett, I don't think so. Wouldn't be as thrilled there. I've heard nothing about Cade Bell being a legitimate candidate. That doesn't mean that he isn't, but because right now there's a lot of radio silence. Norvell's been kind of operating quietly, which is great. But yeah, I don't think Bell is likely to be the guy. He's a good coordinator though, for sure. And if you did get him, you'd want to bring the quarterback with him. But yeah, I've seen nothing credible about that. All right, next question. If you were a betting man, would you bet on Brennan Marion as the offensive coordinator at Florida State next year? Why or why not? That's a good question. The hard part is that your question basically makes it Brennan Marion against the field. And in such cases, I'm not sure it's ever, until you know for sure, I'm not sure it's ever wise to bet, one guy against the field there. But I do think there's a really good chance that is the hire. He's been the guy that's been buzzed about the most. And, obviously a lot of ties to Norvell and a ton of respect for Norvell. So yeah, I think there's a real chance that he's the guy. Now, again, he would not be my first choice. I think he's a good coordinator. I think he's a really good wide receiver coach. But I've said this multiple times, so I won't belabor the point. I think Florida State needs to make sure whoever they hire at coordinator, they need to bring in a guy who is an elite, as close to elite as you can. They need to bring in a quarterback whisperer to be your quarterback coach. And if they don't do that, then they need to bring in a whisperer as a quarterback, analyst who can help in practice with that. Marion is not that. He's coaching quarterbacks right now at UNLV. My impression is he's not a quarterback whisperer. Again, he's more of a receivers guy by trade. Now, look, receivers are tough to coach. So if you can be a really good receivers coach, you can usually coach just about anybody else. But yeah, he would not be my first choice. His offense in year one would be an interesting mix if they could find the right quarterback with the right amount of mobility, because you're looking at it's a very two-back centric with a lot of option type stuff, inside, outside option stuff. And then you'd essentially be turning that over to a set of running backs who would really match what he wants to do, in Cam Davis and Mekhi Danzy, and also Jalen Lucas. Those guys would fit really, really well in the go-go offense that he likes to run. That said, it's a little bit, I would rather have a little bit more multiple offense on some things. And again, I would rather have a little bit more quarterback-centric offense with a guy who's a top-level quarterback guy if I had my choice. But I think it's really a possibility that Marion, a strong possibility that Marion's the hire. I've already said who I would hire. The top guys on my list, I would try to bring in the combination of Tino Sunseri and Mike Shanahan from Indiana. And if I couldn't get one of them, I'd try to get Tino. And Tino would be one of my most important hires this cycle, because I think he's a good quarterbacks guy. And I think he's a future head coach with a solid, background in terms of offense to be able to be a solid offensive coordinator before too long, if not already. So he would probably be my guy. And actually, I just saw that Charles Fishbein on the Fishcast just had an interview with Tino. So if any of you want to know sort of what he's about, go and take a listen to that. I haven't listened to it yet myself, but I did see that that's up, and knowing Tino, that's going to be a good conversation. So, and Tino, again, is a guy who played for Mike Norvell, at Pitt when Norvell was there. Tino was playing quarterback. So, there's links there, but we'll see what happens there on that. All right. And actually that overlaps with the final question that I was going to do. Well, I guess I might do a couple others depending on how long this one actually takes, but in your next mailbag episode. So this is the next question. Feel free to tell us who would be your choices for defensive coordinator and offensive coordinator if it were entirely up to you alone, within reason, of course, as far as names, and assuming that each would be a good fit culturally in Tallahassee. And then tell us your prediction for each coordinator position, even though it could certainly differ from your personal preferences. Yeah, I think if it were up to me, my top choice for defensive coordinator would probably be Tyler Santucci from Georgia Tech. I would also have Jim Leonard and Jay Bateman on the list. Bateman would be very high up there. He's currently at Texas A&M. Those would probably be my first two on the defensive side, or first three, I'd say, is those three. On the offensive side, like I said, I would look at Tino Sunseri, bringing him in for quarterbacks. If I felt really comfortable with him as a potential play caller, I'd bring him in for that as well. But ideally, I'd try to bring both him and Mike Shanahan in from Indiana and give them wide receivers, quarterbacks, and co-offensive coordinator responsibilities, just like they have at Indiana. And, ideally they bring a couple guys with them from Indiana, but those would be my top hires there. And then let's see, at offensive line, I would go with either Matt Applebaum from Georgia Tech, or let's see. So Applebaum at Georgia Tech would be up there, and Mike Bloomgren, the former Stanford offensive line coach and former Rice head coach, who recently was fired as the head coach. Bloomgren would probably be my number one, because I think bringing a guy like that in who, I'm not always that keen on hiring alums, and he is an alum, from a Florida State alum who's, from Tallahassee. So that would be good in some senses, but it's harder to fire an alum. So I'm normally not real keen on going after an alum, but in his case, he's produced elite offensive lines in the past. He's coached in the NFL. He's been a head coach. You're bringing in, and he's been an offensive coordinator. You're bringing in a guy with a ton of experience and a guy who's produced high-level offensive lines in the past. He's probably my number one at offensive line, would be Bloomgren. And as I understand it, there's a real possibility that he could be in play. Matt Applebaum would probably be my next. He's the BC offensive line coach. And I've not actually met him, but I trust someone who said he's been in the meeting room with him, and he was just super impressed by him, and You look at the product that he's put together this year at BC, and you feel pretty good about that. So those would probably be my first two at offensive line. And like I said, I've already given you my coordinator ideas. Wide receiver coach would be one of those, would be, the co-hire if possible. And then, we're going to see some of the other coaches come in. And from what I understand, some of the other ones who will be hired for some of the guys who will be rotating off the staff or leaving, a couple of the names that I've heard for some of those positions are eye-opening. Could be a really talent-laden staff with some guys that can recruit too. One thing I will say, there's been some concern from some folks about whether or not Florida State is actually going to be an attractive location for coaches. I mean, it's one of those things of like, do you want to move? Do you want to move your family to go to Florida State and play for a guy who isn't guaranteed to be there in 2 years at head coach? That's a big risk to take. And then turns out that's not actually been an issue because coaches are a different breed. And these coaches are looking at Florida State at 1-9, and they're all saying, man, if I went there, I could flip that around right away. And they know you take Florida State from where they are right now and flip them around to 9 wins or so next year, and maybe more the year following, which they all believe is possible at Florida State. And they all believe you can flip a team really quickly now. And they're all really confident in their capacity to do so. These are a bunch of guys who are like, I do that, and I'm immediately a hot commodity on the job market and can move up and potentially get, head coaching looks or, advancement opportunities from there. So, some of these guys, there have been some guys who I've had a little bit of interaction with behind the scenes, or I'm aware of some interaction with behind the scenes, who actively want the job and have made it very clear, want the job at their specific spot. And I've been a little surprised by that in a couple cases because, I wasn't sure, well, would that guy actually be interested? No. That guy's really interested. Why? Well, he thinks they can get it flipped around quickly, and that's going to be a feather in his cap that's going to go a long way for moving himself up. So these guys are willing to bet on themselves a lot more than a lot of other people might be. And, they believe the Florida State brand and that Mike Norvell himself also can get things flipped around pretty quickly. So it's worth noting that. All right. Let's see if there's anything else before we finish. This has gone pretty long. Yep, one more. And this is the FSU beat seems to be harping on Norvell's offense being now stale and predictable, almost as if he's no longer an offensive savant and he has peaked. Do you believe that? And if not, why not? And is there any truth to the rumors that Norvell will strengthen his standing with fans by adjusting his contract to account for the coaching buyouts and accept and recognize his mistakes? Thanks again for your excellent work. As always, who knows, maybe you're being considered for a support staff position as well. You should be. Well, first of all, no, I am not being considered for a support staff position. That is not in play, although I'm always happy to help this program as much as I could. That I'm not in play for that. No. But no, so I think Norvell's offense is stale and predictable this year, but it's largely because they can't block, they can't catch, and they're not throwing it real well. And they've not broken tackles when they have gotten things blocked up. And they've not, when you don't have dynamic playmakers and you can't block and you're not very good at the quarterback position, there's not a whole lot you can call that's going to make you look better. Innovation, creative offensive coordination comes from recognizing what you do well and then riffing off of that. And Florida State doesn't do anything well. So what are you going to do? Now, as far as, strengthening his standing by adjusting his contract or whatever, I've heard nothing of the sort. So, if he does that, good for him. If I were him, I certainly wouldn't do that because I wouldn't want to put myself in a position where it would be easier to fire me down the line. But what I would do is I would make some contributions from my salary to offset some of the things moving forward. Make some pledges and pay some money into some places where it's going to get distributed where it needs to go. That is something that I would do. And, depending on what he's able to do there, I wouldn't be surprised to see him do something like that. But I don't think you're going to see a renegotiation of that contract. Again, it would not be in his interest, and I don't know why anybody would expect him to do that. All right. Well, going on a hour and or going on 55 minutes here. So let's go ahead and wrap up. This is going to be it for the weekend. I'm not going to be back, like I said, until probably Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, and then we'll be getting ready for the Florida game. But enjoy what should be Florida State's second win on the season, and if it's not, well, try not to burn anything down in the process. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.